All right, so welcome to the Launching Academy podcast, where we help course creators and coaches that work online to grow their businesses through multiple sources of income. And today we have Chris here, and he's going to talk about podcasts. So how to start a podcast, what you have to do, how to grow your podcast, how to invite people to your podcast. And podcast is so important to a business right now, especially when we are working online. And I think Chris is going to talk about this as well. So Chris, can you tell us about yourself? Who are you? What do you do? And I'm super excited that you're here today.
Epic. Thanks so much for having me on board today. I really, hope I can add some value into everyone listening in. A bit about myself. Well, my name's Chris to start. I've got a brand called TravelFit that really is focused more on shifting people's perspectives through experiences and collaboration events. So it gives people the opportunity to work on their mind, body and soul. Originally from Orange, which is 4 hours away from Sydney inland. Made my way to London for 2 years and now I'm on the sunny Sunshine Coast.
Awesome. So Chris, why did you decide to start a podcast?
Well, originally when I first thought of TravelFit, I was like, all right, what am I going to do with this? What is this? Is this a brand? Is this just a business? Am I doing one thing or am I going to do multiple things? And I kind of came to the conclusion of all right, well, for me to build a brand, I need a mission and a story. And how can people understand why I've created TravelFit if there's no story or mission out there? So I wanted to really go into detail and explain why TravelFit was created, but also give people the opportunity to have value adders in there. So a lot of golden nuggets of some of the people I've interviewed who, may have started from nothing to something, and just have it as something that gives back to the community who is involved in TravelFit or who just pops around and kind of sees it up on Spotify or Apple Podcasts.
And I was privileged to be part of your podcast. So
yeah.
And I know that you focus a lot on the story of the person. Is there a specific reason why you do that?
I personally believe that when we dive into stories, we get a more impactful, attachment to the who's, how's and whys. So if your story is relatable to someone else, then they're going to hold on to information a lot more. And if you're just spitting out facts of how you did this and that, it's great. And it's great for that direct personality. But when there's other things involved, like analytical thinkers, and you got people who are a bit more like dolphin-like Labradors, it's good to have a story because then you can relate those particular experiences to different demographics, and then they can absorb the information you're flowing into these conversations a lot more easily.
Definitely. And now that we're talking about story, how did your story brought you here?
We're at this point. I guess, when I explain my story, there's a long version and a short version. So I'll give you the in-between short and long. But essentially, when I was growing up, my mum had a spinal bifida. She's never been able to walk. My dad was never around. I never met him. He left when I was born. And throughout life, I had the opportunity, and I say opportunity because it's not really, these are all great things that happened to me. I had the opportunity to have challenges from a younger age, where I had to step up to the plate a lot quicker so I could help mum provide. So from the age of 9, I had a job working in cherry yards, and then that went to Macca's and all different roles. But I was lucky enough that I had those opportunities because it started to embed in me the importance of creating independence and resilience in yourself in life. That transferred through to many experiences in life, from a friend who died from a drug overdose, a friend who committed suicide, and my own, challenges in, I had a lot of issues with alcohol and drugs and anxiety and depression when I was younger because I used alcohol and drugs to mask the fact that I couldn't express myself emotionally. Mm-hmm. And that was what allowed me to, have that opportunity to learn that I never felt like I had a tribe or a community to connect to in my darkest times. Mm-hmm. And when I found or created, you could say, my own tribe of like-minded people, that embedded in me the thought of what if I created a tribe of people and gave people opportunities, experiences, and events that I didn't have when I was going through a struggling time in my own life. So moving on, I read one book. I love throwing this book out there, The Alchemist. I read the book The Alchemist when I was living in Orange in 2015. And after seeing a psychologist and working on my anxiety and my depression, I started to heal myself emotionally through like working out, eating well, hanging around the right people, stepping away from a bad network or a tribe that weren't serving me. And then I read this book and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to do it. So I bought a one-way ticket to London at age 22. And I was like, well, we'll figure it out. We'll see what happens. And that's when I realized that life had so much to offer. Like, we're so small. We're a little ant in a big world. And when you realize that, you're like, wow, there is so much opportunities. It's like, yeah, sure, I'm the main actor in my own movie, but there's a lot more roles that can be covered. And it was in the east side of London. I moved to London in 2015. In 2016, I was walking in the east side of London, and I kind of had this reflective thought. I was like, all right, well, what am I going to do when I go back to Australia? You know, I don't really want to go back to just being a PT in my hometown. And what would be something that I could do to create fulfillment in myself and others and live a life that really aligned with me? And it was kind of like I got hit by lightning, and it was just like, Travel Fit, mind, body, and soul, all the things that align with me, mindset, change, shift your behaviors, shift your actions, your beliefs, everything in between, you know, thoughts, language, behaviors, identity. And then going into body in the sense of nutrition, training, and then soul was like, you know, traveling, experiences, things that are different that get you out of that comfort zone and then make you realize, wow, it's good to be alive. It's good to be challenged. It's good to never stay in that comfort zone, always seeking that growth zone. So when I thought of the idea of Travel Fit, I was like, okay, cool. No idea what I'm going to do, but we'll figure something out. It was going to be food trucks, then it was going to be workouts on the go. And then it wasn't until I moved to the Sunshine Coast in 2017, December, through to January 2018, then I started creating a logo, started to formulate what I wanted to do. And I was like, community events, retreats, a podcast, clothing. I just wanted to create a brand that would allow people the opportunity to live a more healthy, holistic life and feel accepted in a tribe of connected humans on the same wavelength that didn't really just want to drink and hide from their own emotional states. So that's like the in-between version of everything.
Oh, that's amazing. And you know what, like for me as a strategy, what you're telling me, it's amazing. Because number one, you took something challenging from your life and you transformed into something that could benefit others. And secondly, you didn't suppress your story and your experiences to create a new business. And that's why I think your business is strong, because you have this background, you have this support, you have this base. And this is really nice. This why, this big why that puts you in a very interesting position. Yeah,
absolutely. And I guess like just when we all find out what it is that we like to do and turn that into a passion project, then I guess eventually then we feel aligned enough to pursue what we want to pursue in life.
Definitely. And again, resilience, transforming the challenges into something to benefit others. Those are characteristics that every online course creator or coach online should develop for their businesses.
And it's one of those things, I guess, like in business, you know, you see people start a business and you see people fail at business. And it usually comes down to the fact that, well, there's probably two things. There's one, the resilience of getting used to being uncomfortable, and two, putting a plan in place that actually gets them on the yellow brick road to see the wizard properly.
Awesome. So now that we know a little bit more about you, your middle version, in-between version, now I want to know about podcasts. How did you start your podcast? How did you start approaching people? Because I think this is a big one, isn't it? How do I approach someone? Do you choose people strategically, or you just anyone, or how do you do this first part of the podcast?
So over time, I've changed my perspective on how I picked people. I was very strict on who I got on my podcast when I first started. Mm-hmm. So I was really strict on, like, you know, they had to be at this certain social status or this point with like, you know, like their followers or their business. And I just didn't want any fake gurus or any, you know, anyone projecting a mission that's not real, or they're just lying out of their teeth. And I'm still stand by those things, but now I focus more on the story than anything. So I don't look at a social status. I look at the story that someone has and how impactful that could be into someone's life. And obviously with that too, there is so if you look at my podcast, you'll see I've got themes. So first themes is kind of like travelers, and then musicians, and then photographers, and then videographers. And then it shifts between like different demographics of people. So I'll focus on those types of people, and then I'll pick my next theme. And that's how I like to work things, because I like to do 3 to 4 episodes with a particular theme of person, because it just value adds that audience that'll come onto the podcast as well, because they'll be like, oh, cool. There's something that, say, a digital marketer has in common with you, is that you're both talking about similar subjects and genres, but 2 completely different experiences and 2 different results or golden nuggets, I guess you could say, that people learn from those particular ways. So that's how I kind of pick things now, is I'll look at I'll really go deep into like where they started. I'll try and learn as much as I can about the person, like what their story is, what they want to do. I'll research, I'll look at their friend groups online, like I'll figure them out as much as I possibly can from a distance. And then from there, I'll send a message out to them. I'll be like, hey, really love what you're doing. I'd love to know a little bit more about like what it is that you're doing. And then I'll get a little bit more information. This is for people from afar. And then from there, I'll be like, cool, well, I really feel aligned to what you do. And I wouldn't offer this if I didn't feel aligned to you. So if you're interested, this is what I do. I interview people around these particular things. If you're interested, I'd love to have you on the podcast, and I'd love to have you share your own story for people listening in who can, you know, change their state, change their life just based off your story and your experiences. And then it'll usually be a yes or a no. And I've had a lot more no's than yeses.
Really?
Yeah. So when I first started, I probably reached out to about 50 people first up. And now those 50 people, I only had 2 people who said yes. And then from there, I got a little bit better at my copy of what I'd say to people. I'd figure out what they want to hear. I'd leverage like how I could help them as well, in the sense of, okay, cool. So you've got like, I had a bodybuilder on, and there was a health and fitness expert coming up, and I was like, all right, cool. So I'd love to have you on board. I love what you do. Also happy to you to leverage my podcast and talk about like the upcoming health and fitness expo that's coming up. It does help as well that I do online articles for a magazine as well. So I leveraged their platform as well. So I figured out like, okay, cool. So I have access to an online magazine, and let me say, it is a small magazine. It's not huge. So don't let that be an excuse to anyone listening in, like, oh, he's got a magazine with, you know, all these thousands of people. That happened like midway through the podcast. At the start, it was just me projecting my own mission and what I wanted to do. So I just like take the objection out of there. So, you know, from that point of like figuring out what people wanted, once I had some leverage to use, I'd be like, all right, cool. I've gotten some main people on the first way. Now I'm going to leverage their audience. So I can leverage the online article, and I can also leverage the past guests. And now I've got a bigger audience to project, you know, getting someone interested in being on the podcast. And now it's at the point now where I create a media kit, and I've got my guests on there with their followers, what they're about, their experience, their business, and just like a short bio essentially, so that people who are interested, they can look into that, and they can be like, oh, wow, he's interviewed an actor, a director, a crazy, like good digital marketer, like whatever it is. And that allows people to see that it's not just like another podcast. So it's starting to refine even more, that it's more quality than quantity too. But I think a huge thing is just being like, all right, well, the goal is I want to have 2 people on my podcast, and there's probably there's a few billion people in the world. So what's the worst that can happen? I send out 100, 200, 300 messages and I only get 2 people on my podcast. Okay, cool. Well, if every person that you reach out to is a quality person, like someone that you align with, someone that is projecting a mission that is something that you feel would be beneficial to someone else and they're not a fake guru, then cool, do that to 2. Do it to the similar personality types that are in the same boat as that one person. And now those 300 people, you get 2 people. Great. That's now opened a door for you to be like, all right, cool. I've had these people on my podcast. It's legitimate. Now I'm going to leverage their audience and I'm going to reach out to their friends. Mm-hmm. So looking at those particular things is like just trying to leverage what you're building. The first bit's the hardest, which is reaching out to a lot. The easiest bit is like being like, all right, cool. And even saying to people I've had on my podcast, hey, I'm looking for guests who are really interesting, who add value. Who would you recommend? And that's been another way that I've had people on my podcast as well.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Now I would get back a little bit to the no part. So how did you feel when you received these no's and how did you move forward internally? Because I think this is one of the biggest blockages from people when they are selling something or starting a business. Is like, how do I feel and how do I manage that feeling?
I think it comes down to a lot more of a deeper rooted cause than just being afraid to have someone say no to you. I think it comes down to like, all right, well, why do you get offended or why do you feel personally attacked when someone says no? So asking yourself the question of, all right, is it because my dad left when I was born and I'm a prime example of that. I used to project that a lot. Is it the fact that if someone says no to you, it makes you feel like you're never good enough? So you do have worthiness, rooted issues or rooted struggles that you need to work through. So just like diving a little bit deeper in and answering your own questions and being like, all right, cool, this affected me in some weird way. I now feel really uncomfortable and I feel unworthy and I feel like I'm not good enough. Why do I feel that way? And like solving your own problems, because if you can just say to yourself, all right, they said no, is what it is. They're probably busy. They've got things on. They're in their own movie. It's not an issue for me. There's another billion people out there I can reach out to. And just setting prior, I think that the thing that helped me get used to rejection was being like, my goal is 100 people that I'm going to reach out to. And I'm not going to take anything personally until those 100 people say no to me. Guaranteed, 100 people aren't going to say no to you.
Yeah. No, really, really good. Yeah, I think you're touching something very important in here because, again, when you're selling or starting, this rejection, the feeling of rejection makes us not really go there and do what we have to do. Not like, reach out to 50 people, 100 people.
Yeah.
It's like,
what's the worst that can happen?
You say this I reached out, 50 people, but not many people do that.
100%. And, but you also have to be mindful of like, don't reach out to 100 people and be like, hey, I've got a podcast. Do you want to go on it? That's not an equal exchange of energy as well. Like you still have to put effort in. It doesn't matter if you write a copy and then you adjust each copy as you send it. But as long as there's effort in the copy that you send to that person, I think that's a big thing, because if you don't put effort into what you're doing, people aren't going to respect you enough to reply either.
And do you know, when you were talking to someone, so you start saying, yeah, I love your content. I want to learn more about what you do. Then they are going to reply. And then you keep the conversation a little bit before inviting someone.
Yeah. Like a prime example is like, I use it. It's pretty blunt, this example, but when you go on a date, you don't try and sleep with them straight away. You have to you take someone out on a date. And it's for guys and girls. You take them on a date a few times, you build rapport, and then I guess you might sleep with them or whatever, or you might ask them out, whatever it is. But if you can relate that to business in the sense of stop trying to sleep with every person when you first encounter them. that's kind of weird. Like you don't go up to a stranger and be like, hey, do you want to come back to mine? Like that's not like socially acceptable. Why don't you say, for instance, why don't you acknowledge what they're doing really well and actually be genuinely intrigued? Don't like, obviously, like, don't ask people if you're not really interested, because they're not the right candidate for your podcast if you're not interested in what they're doing. So build on the rapport. I've got a rule, like 3 encounters before I ask someone on the podcast. So 3 valuable conversations with someone, build rapport, build a connection, and then you earn the right to ask them on your podcast. And that's going to increase your chances of actually having them on your podcast too.
Amazing. And again, another very insightful point of view that you brought, which is we are such a society of like immediate pleasure and immediate everything, that even establishing this value for some people is like, oh, do I really need to do that? I want to go directly. So, yeah, that's very good. I
think a huge thing, hey, like just people always think seeking the instant gratification, but you don't appreciate something unless you go through a process of learning and then you get the outcome. Like anyone who always seeks to get the outcome straight away never appreciates what they have.
Exactly. Okay, so now we covered how you reach out to people, so how you get people to your podcast. Now, what about promoting your podcast? How do you do that?
I'm pretty organic with the way that I promote my stuff. A cheeky little way that I do it is I do a lot of like tagging on Instagram of them. So for instance, I'll do like a few clips of like the podcast episode. So just like I always try and clip 30 seconds of like parts of a podcast that sounds controversial, or it sounds challenging, or it just doesn't sound like the normal. If I can, like I'll always aim for that. So I'll do that. I'll create a graphic. I'll promote it on my Instagram accounts. I'll put it on Facebook. At one point at the start, I started putting it on like community boards too. And I just be like, hey, I've got this podcast. I've just started it. If you're interested, it's about this, this, and this. Have a listen. Doesn't hurt to do that. You can do things like Reddit. You can post like your podcast on Reddit in the, say, mindset section or the health section or whatever it is. The biggest thing that got me traction personally was from tagging the people I interviewed. So I built my community of other people's community. So I was leveraging other people's audiences. I think that was probably the biggest thing for me personally.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. If you ask the person to, oh, can you share this with your audience? Or if it's more just tagging them and seeing if they share.
I'll always, like at the start, I was very like, hey, would you mind sharing this? And then they'd share it. Not gonna lie, now I kind of just, I tag people and people usually just reshare it. Like it just comes off that way now, which is really good. But I still think that comes down to the fact that I built a little graphic that looks somewhat okay.
Yeah, perfect.
I think the title is a huge thing too. If you can write a really an interesting title, then you can really capture people's attention just with the title too.
How do you usually choose your title?
I look in, like I listen to the episode after, and then I try and pinpoint what stood out for me. But I also try and utilize a title that captures the guest's point of view too. So for example, I'm just trying to think of some of the titles. I think one of them was I interviewed a guy and he started up this franchise gym 3 years ago, and he was born in a country town. He talks about business, how he's failed and how he's built himself out of situations through opportunities that he's created and solving problems in business. And we talked a lot about like building up resources for a fight back. So like getting your life under control by, setting the foundations, finding a problem, solving the problem, getting yourself to a point where it's a successful business. So I called that planning your fight back with Rowan, etc. And that captivated more or less like not being on top of your game, but learning how to bounce back from when life kind of hits you hard. And the interesting thing about that is like now these gyms 3 years ago to now are now popping up all around Australia and New Zealand. And it's crazy because it's just like, I looked at him and like he only, like he started one gym and he's projecting this mission of what he wanted and how he wanted to do it. And it was about mental health and Everest, like altitude training versus Everest and etc. But it all kind of stemmed back to just fighting yourself out of a dark tunnel in life through health and wellness.
Very interesting. And do you put because I've listened to some podcasts and they put exactly this like hook, this very interesting part in the beginning, and then they start the podcast. Do you do that?
Funnily enough, I don't do that. I should do that because I would recommend people do that, because I've got a few people I know who have podcasts as well. And that's what draws people in straight away is that first sentence.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I guess I kind of use my hook for the graphic and audio that I attach to that 30-second clip as my hook. And then I push that through a link to the podcast episode.
And
I'd
do you...
highly recommend it.
Sorry.
I highly recommend like people put it at the start of their podcast.
Perfect. And do you host your podcast only in your website, or do you put it on Spotify, Apple, and all these other platforms?
So the podcast is projected on, I think it's like 4 or 5 different channels. So Apple, Spotify, and then like a few other ones. And I do that all through Anchor. So there's all these different podcast platforms that you can use. You can use like Podbean and a few other ones. But Anchor is what I use because it directly puts it on like 6 different platforms. So obviously the likelihood that you're going to reach a bigger audience like increases quite a bit. And it just makes it a lot like the analytics of seeing like, what countries people are listening in or like how many listeners per episode is still quite good. But it's a really easy way, a beginner's guide to actually get into podcasting.
Awesome. Amazing. Perfect. Now, in general, in terms of your story, the podcast that you're building, the number of connections that you made so far, what would be like 3 tips that you could give to these course creators and coaches that are working online, they are building their sales structures, they are reaching out to people, selling their services, putting themselves out there? So what could you tell them? Something that meant a lot to you throughout your life and your achievements?
I think the biggest thing that comes to mind for me is like, one would be like genuinely adding value, like diving a little bit deeper, I guess, like with your questions, like being really specific and pushing people a little bit further. Like that's something I really do try and do. Like I remember I interviewed one guy and he was just giving me surface level answers. And I was like, yeah, but why? Like that doesn't help it. And I'll bluntly be like, well, that doesn't like help essentially in the way that I project. I'm like, well, why? How? What do you do for people listening in? And like answering, like saying for people listening in, how would you explain that? And opening the door to detail, because a lot of the time when you interview people, they'll answer in a surface level way, sometimes, not all the times. And that means that you have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing until you get the golden nugget, because to get to a treasure chest, you have to unlock the lock. So, and it's not going to come easy. So you've got to find the right question, push the key in, unlock it, and then you'll get the golden nugget that you're looking for. So being persistent, I think, is a huge one when interviewing people. We all know if you ask the right questions, you get the right answers. So I think that's a huge thing, being persistent, asking the right questions, and just not shying away from being a little bit aggressive in the way that like how you keep asking in different ways, because we all learn or we all understand in different ways. Like, visually, I might take in me moving my hands as a way to open up, or I might understand like speech more, so language. So I might be like, you have to ask me the right questions, or it might be you have to trigger an emotional response in me for me to actually open up and become passionate about a subject. So maybe just like figuring out the person before you get them on, but then also trying out different methods as you're interviewing, figuring out what that method is once you figure it out in the podcast. I usually do like 10 minutes to 15 minutes sometimes pre-recording, just to figure out what gets someone to fully open up, or I'll build the rapport before we dive into the podcast so that they feel safe enough to actually share maybe their experiences, or open up a little bit more, because essentially I am a stranger at the end of the day. And for someone to feel really comfortable, you have to, build that foundation. That would be number one, I guess. Number two, know your structure. So understand how your podcast is going to look. What's the intro question that you're going to ask? So to get everything rolling, nothing too crazy. What's the next question that's going to dive maybe deeper or open the treasure chest? What's the structure of that look like? So question based, about keeping in the right lane the whole time. So not veering left and right like a crazy person on the road, knowing where you're going with the interview and the questions that you're going to ask, but also having the ability to let it free flow as well, because the more authentic answers you get, the more relatability and emotional attachments that, people will feel, because no one wants to hear a robot either.
And I think here we go back to one of your first comments, which you said, I want people that I'm genuinely interested on. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to get in the flow with this person.
100%. And it's like having lunch with a stranger, and then like they don't really want to talk, and you're like really talkative, and you're like, so how's your day? And they're like, good. And you're like, all right, cool. Do you come here often? No. Okay, sweet. All right. So like, if you're not interested, they're not going to be interested, and it's going to be this really stagnant, awkward chat.
Yeah, definitely.
And I guess probably the third thing would be like honing down on your plan, I guess, in the podcast world. So like what your niche is, like what do you want to do? Mindset? Do you want to do health and wellness? Do you want to do empowerment for women? Do you want to do digital marketing? Do you want to do how to create a YouTube series through a podcast series? Like there's so many cool things that you can pick on. So just finding what your niche is, education, mindset, health, etc. Through your plan, figuring out how many followers you want to have by a certain date, how many listeners you want to have by a certain date, figuring out like, I don't know, like I just do this because I really enjoy it. Like it's fun. But you can dive into like sponsorships with local businesses. If you interview people locally, you can monetize it that way, or you can build it up high enough so that you can monetize it through bigger brands. Yeah. So just figuring out your plan of attack is, I think, a huge one, because if it's not in front of you, you don't understand what you're doing, then you're going to be like a blind man walking the streets trying to cross the road.
Yeah, definitely. And transforming this plan into something non-negotiable for you. Like that's my goal, and I'm going to do it and achieve it. And Chris, how often do you post? Do you do a podcast? How often do you post?
Look, I'm not the most frequent person with my podcast, but it's actually wild because I looked at my analytics the other day, and I'm getting about 100 to 200 listens per episode. I'm listened to in 32 countries.
Wow.
And that comes from how aggressive I was at the start. But I post at the moment twice a month.
Perfect. And what do you recommend?
If you look, it depends on every person's different. I do this as like a value adder onto the Travel Fit brand. Like it's just an opportunity to give back to the community, allow people to learn things for free, and to have a platform where I can voice people's stories and allow people to grow. But I think if you honestly, like, the reason that I am not where I could be, and I'm pretty realistic about, like, open with like why I'm here, like at this point where I could have been like 1,000 listeners, is the fact that I didn't post once a week, every week. I think that, like, realistically, if you want to make it a successful thing, like, but like monetize it wise, I mean, and not just like a value adder, then you need to do it like once a week, non-negotiable, continuously for the next 2-3 years.
Wow, amazing. Thank you, Chris. Got a lot of value out of it. I was like, I'm not doing this or that. I should start doing it. I love it.
It's a learning lesson, and I don't know, I just think it's crazy because, like, fun fact, like I used to record my episodes in my wardrobe because it was really good sounding.
Really?
And I'd feel like I'd be in the dark and I'd be interviewing someone, and it was just the funniest experience. I did that for the first like 4 episodes, and I was like, no, I could literally just do this at an office now. And, you know, it was all off my phone at the start. I didn't even do Zooms at the start. And I think, like, stop chasing perfection, just do it.
The first time I heard the term podcast, I used to think it was like this room equipped and that I needed this high-tech microphone.
Lighting, yeah,
all of those things. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to leave it for later. And you actually really inspired me because I went to your podcast. First, you made me feel super comfortable when I was there. And we were on Zoom, you know, like I was in my house. So it broke a lot of objections that I had in starting them. So I really appreciate that.
That's epic. Oh, that makes me so happy.
Yeah.
Oh, that's it.
Thank you so much, Chris. So thank you for everybody that listened. And we will have, as Chris said, 1 podcast per week for the next 2 to 3 years. I'll see you soon. Thank you, Chris.